name is Matt Foley. I am 35 years old, I am divorced, and I live in a van down by the river. Okay, not really. Actually, my name is Jeff, otherwise known as the SP Spaz, and this is part 2 of my educational series on the myths and the truth about SPs. So if you haven't seen part 1, stop this video now and watch it. Otherwise, you'll be horribly confused. Okay, not really, probably, but anyway, to recap, I was talking about some of the common stereotypes about SPs, all being people that are constantly getting drunk and stoned and jumping out of buildings and things like that. Now, if you know somebody who's constantly drunk and stoned and jumping out of buildings, there is a likelihood that that person is an SP, but it's kind of like that old thing about, Steve is an elephant and Steve is pink, therefore all elephants are pink, that the logic doesn't follow. Well, not all SPs are pink elephants, so that's kind of the point I'm trying to make, is that yes, there are plenty of SPs who have kind of done the overdose on everything until you get found in a gutter somewhere lifestyle, but that's still actually probably not the majority. Probably represents just a minority that, tends to get read about and talked about because it's extreme. So, at this point you might be saying, okay, Jeff, you've talked about these things that, don't represent SPs, so what is it that does? Like, what's the thing that really makes an SP? Well, if I had to sum it up in one word, it would be freedom. Now, there's plenty of other words that, you can use, such as action, sensation seeking, some of those that I've heard. I think in Please Understand Me, there's a really good line about the next, I can't remember the exact line, but it's something to do with the next moment or the next action is a free variable, that kind of sums it up. But I chose freedom as kind of just like the really quick way to say that. And I know your initial thought might be, well, hey, Jeff, everybody values freedom. I mean, that's not something that is exclusive to SPs. Yes, but not to the degree that SPs do. The artisan temperament is kind of summed up by basically like, we don't want to be tied down to anything. Freedom isn't just a word or a slogan or something to put on a poster or a buzzword for political campaigns or something. It actually is kind of the core of our being. In other words, then we want to have the next moment free to do what we want to do in the next moment and not have an obligation to do something or somebody that is trying to control us to do something. And that leads to, of course, a lot of what could be considered rebellion, because most of the time, in most civilized society, people don't have complete freedom. There are restrictions and controls and boundaries that are there based on the environment and what all the circumstances of where you are. But see, the thing is the interesting thing about this is that SPs actually need those restrictions and boundaries and controls, because kind of our purpose in life is to have those boundaries where we push against them. We need rules so we can break rules. We need a structure so we can rebel against it. It's kind of like a yin-yang thing there. It's without any kind of restraint or restriction or control or boundary or any of that, then yeah, that's when we become the overdosing crazy people. Just because basically if you don't have the opportunity to get a thrill from something that's maybe a little more low-key, then you continue to seek thrills that are more and more extreme. So, if you grew up in an environment where if you talk, you could be put to death, then an SP in that environment might, look for ways to whisper or talk when nobody's around, or if in a castle prison cell where there was no escape, one might etch drawings on the wall. So this is an extreme example, but the fact is that whatever the environment or the background or the place that an SP is in, the motivation is to basically act in a free way in whatever way that's possible. So whatever structure is in place, push against it. Whatever boundaries are there, test them. And it's not in the same way, because you can say, well, NTs try to do experiments and test boundaries and stuff. But it's different, because NTs are usually seeking to gain a particular knowledge from that. It's kind of like do an experiment to see what happens and then adjust something, or see how something can be made more efficient or improved. In the case of SPs, none of that is necessarily what's going on. Though we may try to improve our own tactics or our own techniques in certain areas and learn from experience of what happens, it's not usually for a specific purpose of knowledge. It's simply that that's what our instinctual action is to test things, push against things, bust through things. And so, like I said earlier, when that gets taken to an extreme, then it does become the OD on crack or whatever happens to be. The thing is like for a lot of us, like the crack may be something else. It may not actually be crack. So it's probably not too much of a secret as you gaze upon me that food has definitely been something that I've indulged in quite a bit. I have a little bit of a weight problem. But the thing is when I have focused on losing weight, getting healthy, getting in better shape, and that's really been what has consumed me, I've done it. 2 years ago, I lost about 30 pounds and was in a whole lot better shape, got stronger, And I'm still in better shape now than I was before I started doing that. However, I gained most of that weight back. And the simple reason was that stopped being my focus in life. As it turns out, my birthday 2 years ago, I got a PlayStation 3. So, and the MLB 10 The Show video game, which then became the focus of my life. Which I know to some people sounds kind of pathetic, but the point is that in the SP world, you might say, there's no distinction between like important lifestyle focuses and non-important ones, according to society or anybody else. So an SP that is focused on feeding starving children is going to go hardcore in feeding starving children. And a lot of people are going to go, oh, this person is awesome because he cares about children. And he probably does. But the SP that is concentrating on mountain biking, and that's all he or she ever does, that is just as much a legitimate use of freedom as feeding starving children. And that's kind of the disconnect that I think some people have, is that the SJs and even the NFs and even the NTs, although they don't tend to be maybe as judgmental about the morals of things, but they're looking at it as those are like two wildly different things in terms of, well, they can't be motivated by the same thing. But the truth is, they actually are. And so that's the kind of thing I'm trying to get across here, is that this kind of rebelliousness, the freedom, the want of action in the moment, it's not always an attempt to like shock somebody or destroy things or You know, those kind of things can come from that same thing. They spring up from those instincts, but that's not the initial instinct. I had a long conversation back last Thanksgiving with my little brother, another SP, and I was talking about, we talked about a ton of things, but one of the things I said was that my instinct in any environment is basically to kind of switch it up, twist it up, turn it in some way, flip it on its head. And that doesn't mean every second that I'm doing that, because there's plenty of times where I'm, may not appear to be really messing with anything. But even then, I'm still sort of motivated by that. So it's a little hard to explain if you don't feel that same way. He knew exactly what I was talking about, because in general he feels the same way, even though we have different interests and a lot of things that we could talk about on a surface level we may not necessarily agree on, but we have those same kind of basic core motivations. And that's, I guess, what I'm trying to get across with this, is that that kind of description, like the NF geeks did about getting drunk, getting laid, and jumping out of an airplane. It's a funny kind of stereotype to say about SPs, but obviously there's plenty of people that don't fit that still fit the temperament description, because that next moment of action and freedom is their driving force. Personally, one of the other things I liked the best in the Please Understand Me Too book, David Kersey's book, was the part about the entertainers, which he uses to kind of lump ISFPs and ESFPs together, versus the operators, or the STPs, the ISTPs and the ESTPs. And that the difference, I guess probably the main difference between us is that the operator types are driven more by, I guess, inanimate things, you could say, tools, weapons, mechanical type stuff, electrical, tend to focus more on non-living things, or if they are living things, like not humans, whereas the SFPs or entertainers tend to be more people-based. Our driving force is to, well, like the name entertainer says, to entertain people, to show somebody something cool, something beautiful, something interesting, to get a positive response or make a positive difference in someone's life with something that we can create or something that we can show someone. That's like the ultimate high. And sometimes it's pretty simple. It doesn't necessarily take like a huge reaction from someone or something being, you don't have to have paintings on display in the Louvre. It could be as simple as somebody saying, what you made was cool, or what the joke you said was funny, things like that, the buzz will last for a while. So, it isn't necessarily the extreme that is necessary to kind of satiate that SP lust for freedom. The way I grew up with pretty strict parents, especially my father, when my parents got divorced and I went to live with my mother, I took pleasure in the fact that I could get Skippy peanut butter, and I could have Golden Grams and Cinnamon Toast Crunch for breakfast, and I could watch MTV when I got home from school, because when I still lived with my father, I wasn't allowed to watch MTV, and we weren't allowed to have peanut butter with sugar in it or cereals with very much sugar in them. So those things sound like kind of really simple things and not anything extreme. And that's my point, is that the thrills don't necessarily have to be quite as over the top. The motivation within that boundary is the same. It's just the scale or the perspective is different. And that applies to different cultures too, because there's plenty of SPs that live in cultures such as the Middle East or East Asia, or places where, as a general rule, as Americans, we look at them as kind of more conservative cultures and people not being very wild or outlandish or anything like that in their behavior. But the thing is, the SPs are there too. It's just within that culture and that environment, the things that they are doing to push boundaries and rebel and do their things, to Americans might not seem as big of a deal. But within that culture, they would be. So that's kind of the gist of it, is that so much depends on where you are and who you're around in terms of how they interpret your behavior and whether you're seen that way. I remember one particular ESTJ woman that, when I read her or showed her the description of SPs and said I belong to that temperament, she said something along the lines of, well, that doesn't seem right because you're not all wild and crazy. And that's kind of my point, is that, it is not going to necessarily be something that appears to everyone to be wild and crazy. But there is still an element of wildness and craziness, because the driving force is a free action in the moment. So hopefully all that made sense and gave you a little bit more insight as to what the driving force of SPs is, and that we're all not necessarily going to be the type that's going to be found in a gutter somewhere. Although I have told people that, as far as the whole jumping out of a plane thing goes, the older I get, the more likely I am to do that. So like if I'm still around when I'm 70 or 80 or something like that, I probably will be trying to do the most extreme things I can possibly do, because I'm like, if I made it that far, like I don't want to live in some nursing home for 20 years or something. So if I'm still around, I'm going to be doing things, not to try to kill myself, don't get me wrong, but to basically test all of those limits, whatever I haven't done at that point, so I will get more and more extreme the older I get, because at that point I'll probably have felt like, well, I've pretty much done what I can do with this body, so time to go ahead and, wear it out. It's like when people ask me, do you want to have a burial when you die, or do you want to be cremated? Well, what I came up with was, actually I want to be cremated naturally. In other words, I'd like my body to be taken up into space and jettisoned into the sun. So that'll be it for this particular video. Any questions or comments that you have for me are very much appreciated. So if there's more stuff you want to hear about, there's things that I've kind of got in mind to respond to some of the NF Geeks videos. But if you see this and you say, hey, before you do that, I want to know the following 8 or 9 things or whatever, I want to hear you talk about blah, that's fine. I will talk about blah. I actually like blah. So let me know. Tell me what it is you want to hear and tell me your feedback on this, and I'll be happy to respond. And thanks for watching. See you next time.